The immense human suffering caused during the creation of the atomic bomb begins long before the world ever witnessed the blinding flash over Hiroshima. It begins in hidden deserts, secret laboratories, and quiet towns where ordinary people unknowingly stepped into the path of history's most destructive invention. The building of the bomb was not just a scientific mission. It was an ordeal that demanded sacrifice from thousands who never truly understood what they were giving. Workers at nuclear facilities were pushed into exhausting schedules, handling toxic materials without proper protection, breathing air heavy with particles that would linger in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Many fell sick, many died young, and their families were left with questions that were never officially answered. Behind high fences and guarded doors, human health became a silent currency exchanged for national security. Those who lived near testing grounds suffered in even quieter ways. They watched strange clouds drift across the sky after each detonation, not knowing that these clouds carried particles capable of altering their blood, their lungs, and even the DNA of unborn children. The symptoms appeared: slowly burning throats, unusual fatigue, unexplained cancers. Entire communities felt the effects, yet they had no name for their suffering. Farmers saw their animals grow weak, their fields lose vitality, their water turn unsafe. The landscape that had sustained generations transformed into a source of illness. For many, the fear was not only for themselves, but for their children. Mothers held newborns who faced illnesses they never understood, while fathers worked the same contaminated soil that fed their families. The bomb had not yet been dropped on a city, yet its shadow had already fallen on thousands of innocent lives. Even the scientists who built the weapon could not escape the human cost. They carried emotional wounds, knowing that each calculation and design moved them closer to unleashing devastation, unlike anything the world had seen. In their struggle, sleepless nights and moral conflict intertwined. Some became physically drained, others spiritually broken. The pressure of secrecy isolated them from friends and family, and the burden of their work weighed heavily on their conscience. They were celebrated as geniuses, but many felt like mourners long before the bomb was ever used. All these layers of suffering formed the true cost of building the bomb, silent, unspoken, and scattered across lives that history rarely brings into focus. The weapon burned cities in seconds, but the process of creating it burned people slowly, quietly, and permanently. The moral weight carried by the scientists who created the atomic bomb was a burden unlike anything faced in the history of science. These were individuals trained to explore, to innovate, to push the boundaries of human understanding for the sake of progress. Yet, during the race to develop the bomb, their brilliance was redirected toward the creation of a weapon designed to annihilate entire populations. Their laboratories became battlegrounds of conscience, where every breakthrough brought pride mixed with dread. Many of them knew the theoretical power of the device they were building, but the emotional reality grew heavier each day. The equations on their chalkboards were not just mathematical solutions. They were silent reminders of the devastation that would follow once the world witnessed the first detonation. Inside the secret research centers, moral dilemmas lingered in the air more heavily than the dust from their experiments. Scientists who had spent their careers imagining lives saved through medicine, energy, and technology were now part of a project fueled by fear, urgency, and global conflict. They justified their work by convincing themselves that the enemy might reach the same discovery first, and this fear became the thread they clung to as they pushed forward. Yet deep down, many questioned whether any justification could truly excuse creating a force capable of wiping out cities in a heartbeat. Conversations were whispered, doubts were hidden, and emotions were buried beneath layers of duty and secrecy. As the project advanced, the weight grew even more unbearable. The closer they came to a functioning weapon, the clearer the consequences became. Some scientists imagined the screams of those who would stand beneath the fire they were preparing to unleash. Others felt trapped, convinced that their refusal to participate would not stop the bomb from being built. It would only remove their influence over how it was used. Their nights became longer, their thoughts darker, and their sense of purpose more fractured. Even after the bomb was completed and detonated, the moral struggle did not end. For many, it intensified. They saw images of the ruined cities and realized the true magnitude of what they had helped create. Some dedicated the rest of their lives to speaking against nuclear weapons, driven by guilt and sorrow. Others quietly carried the burden until their final days, never finding peace. The moral weight of the atomic bomb was not just a moment in history. It was a lifelong shadow cast across the minds of those who made it possible. The environmental destruction caused by nuclear testing began the moment the first blast lit up the desert sky. Each test released a surge of energy that not only tore through the ground, but also scattered radioactive particles across vast areas. These particles settled into the soil, seeped into water sources, and drifted through the air with winds that carried contamination far beyond the test sites. What looked like barren stretches of land soon became zones where life struggled to survive. Plants that once grew naturally began to wither, and animals suffered from illnesses linked to radiation exposure. The land itself seemed to carry an invisible wound, one that could not heal within a human lifetime. The oceans also bore the scars of these experiments. Tests conducted on remote islands sent shockwaves through coral reefs and marine ecosystems, destroying habitats that had developed over centuries. Radioactive materials sank into the seafloor, slowly entering the food chain. Fish carried traces of contamination, and coastal communities unknowingly consumed food that carried unseen risks. These effects did not remain confined to one generation. The damage extended forward as ecosystems weakened and species faced long-term disruption. Even decades after the testing slowed, the environment continued to speak of the harm done. Craters remained carved into landscapes, radiation hotspots persisted, and certain areas became permanently unsuitable for living. The natural world, which had no voice to warn or resist, absorbed the consequences of humanity's race for power. The destruction did not come with a single explosion. It unfolded quietly, persistently, and across generati. The environmental destruction caused by nuclear testing unfolded slowly, often unnoticed by the wider world, yet its impact was devastating and long-lasting. When the first atomic tests were carried out, massive fireballs scorched the earth, leaving behind craters where life once existed. The heat melted sand into glass, trees were turned into ash, and entire stretches of land lost their ability to sustain plants or animals. But the physical damage was only the beginning. The real threat drifted through the air, fine particles of radioactive dust that the wind carried far beyond the test sites. These particles settled into soil, slipped into rivers, and spread across oceans, silently contaminating ecosystems that had existed peacefully for centuries. Animals consumed poisoned plants, and their bodies absorbed radiation that altered their health, behavior, and even their genetic structure. Some species experienced sudden declines, while others developed abnormalities that scientists later traced back to exposure from nuclear fallout. Marine life suffered as well, especially in island regions where underwater tests disrupted coral reefs and poisoned surrounding waters. The environment bore scars that could not heal within a single lifetime. Even decades after testing ended, some regions remain too contaminated for safe habitation. The soil still holds remnants of invisible danger, and water sources must be monitored to ensure they do not carry the past into the present. The environmental cost of building the bomb continues to echo through damaged landscapes, reminding the world that the Earth itself paid a price that cannot be undone. The political tensions ignited by the creation of the atomic bomb reshaped global relationships in ways the world had never experienced before. Once the bomb existed, it introduced a new kind of power, one capable of wiping out entire nations in seconds, and this changed how countries viewed both their allies and their enemies. Fear became a governing force in politics. Nations raced to build their own nuclear stockpiles, believing that strength no longer came from armies alone, but from the ability to strike back with catastrophic force. Diplomacy grew colder, conversations between leaders became more cautious, and the threat of nuclear war hovered over every disagreement, no matter how small. Ordinary citizens felt this shift deeply. The possibility of sudden destruction created an atmosphere of constant anxiety, shaping the culture of entire generations. Schools practiced emergency drills, governments issued warnings, and families quietly wondered whether a global conflict might erupt at any moment. International relations became a delicate balance of threats, promises, and uneasy truces. Countries formed alliances not out of trust, but out of fear of isolation in a world where one wrong decision could trigger irreversible devastation. The political world gradually accepted a new reality. Power was no longer measured solely by diplomacy or military strength, but by the terrifying potential of nuclear weapons. This reshaping of global dynamics became one of the most profound consequences of the bomb, leaving nations locked in a silent competition where survival depended on caution, strategy, and a shared fear of what might happen if diplomacy failed. The environmental destruction caused by nuclear testing began long before the world understood what radiation truly meant. When the first tests shook remote deserts and distant islands, the explosions did more than split atoms. They altered the land, water, and air in ways that would last for centuries. The earth around the detonation sites was scarred with deep craters, the soil fused into strange glass, like structures by unimaginable heat. Beneath the surface, radioactive particles seeped into groundwater, spreading silently into streams, wells, and oceans. Animals wandered across contaminated land, absorbing toxins without any chance of survival, while delicate ecosystems collapsed under the weight of an invisible threat. Plants withered, mutated, or failed to grow at all, leaving once fertile places barren. Even miles away, winds carried radioactive dust to unsuspecting towns, settling onto rooftops, fields, and the lungs of people who went about their normal lives. Entire islands in the Pacific became uninhabitable, their people forced from ancestral homes that could no longer sustain life. The environment, once a silent witness to human actions, became a victim of an experiment too powerful for nature to endure. The long-lasting contamination remains in many places, a reminder that the cost of the bomb extends far beyond the moment of explosion. It reshaped landscapes, poisoned waters, and left behind scars that no passage of time can fully. The political tensions sparked by the creation of the atomic bomb reshaped the entire world, turning global relationships into fragile threads held together by fear. Once nations witnessed the unimaginable power contained within a single weapon, diplomacy transformed into a high-stakes game where every decision carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Governments raced to build their own nuclear arsenals, believing that strength came not from peace, but from the ability to destroy. This new reality created an atmosphere of distrust so intense that even minor disagreements felt like potential triggers for global disaster. Leaders met behind closed doors, aware that a single miscalculation could unleash consequences too overwhelming to control. Citizens, too, felt the pressure of this new era, living with the constant reminder that a political conflict thousands of miles away could instantly appear in their own skies. International conflicts grew sharper, alliances more necessary, and rivalries more dangerous. The bomb did not simply shape military strategy. It rewrote the psychological landscape of the world, planting fear in the minds of both rulers and ordinary people. Yet even as tensions grew, diplomacy struggled to remain a force of stability, trying to balance power with responsibility. The political world became a place where caution, secrecy, and suspicion overshadowed dialogue, and where the existence of the bomb influenced every major decision afterward. Its presence turned world politics into a delicate balancing act that still defines our global reality today. The psychological toll on communities that survived or witnessed nuclear events is a wound that time has never fully healed. When the bomb exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it did more than shatter buildings. It shattered the sense of safety, stability, and identity that people had known all their lives. Survivors carried memories too heavy to describe, memories filled with blinding light, burning heat, and the desperate search for loved ones in a world suddenly turned to shadows. For many, these moments replayed endlessly, turning into nightmares that followed them into adulthood and old age. The trauma extended beyond physical injuries, weaving itself into their everyday lives. Simple sounds like thunder or airplanes brought waves of fear. Children grew up hearing stories of loss, learning to navigate a world shaped by sorrow they never personally witnessed. Communities lived with stigma as well, branded by others as contaminated or unlucky, as if the tragedy had marked them in ways that could not be erased. The psychological burden also spread to future generations, who inherited the emotional weight of their parents' and grandparents' suffering. Even in places where only tests occurred, the uncertainty about long-term effects created constant anxiety. People questioned the safety of their bodies, their land, and their future. The bomb's psychological cost became a quiet presence in daily life, an invisible echo of a moment that forever changed how communities understood danger, survival, and the fragility of human existence. The environmental destruction caused by nuclear testing began long before scientists fully understood the long-term consequences of radiation. When the first test exploded in the desert, the ground turned to glass and the air filled with particles that would drift far beyond the test site. Trees withered, animals died, and the soil lost its natural life. The explosions did not just scar the land, they changed it on a molecular level, leaving behind elements that would remain toxic for generations. Oceans, too, became silent witnesses. Underwater tests created shockwaves that killed marine life instantly and contaminated waters that once supported vibrant ecosystems. Coral reefs shattered, fish populations collapsed, and the delicate balance of underwater life was disturbed in ways that could never be fully repaired. Even the atmosphere was not spared. Radioactive clouds traveled across continents, settling into rainwater and entering the food chain through crops and livestock. Communities living far from the test sites found traces of radiation in their bodies, proving that the environment has no borders when it comes to fallout. The Earth absorbed the consequences of each detonation, storing them in the soil, water, and air. Over time, landscapes that were once rich with life became zones of silence, where nothing grew and no one dared to live. The environmental damage was not a temporary wound, but a lasting reminder of how the smallest particles released during testing could alter the planet in ways humanity never intended. The political tensions created by the atomic bomb reshaped global relations in ways that defined the entire 20th century. Once the bomb existed, every nation understood that power was no longer measured by armies alone, but by the ability to unleash unimaginable destruction in seconds. Countries that possessed the technology gained influence, and those without it lived under constant pressure to catch up. This imbalance fueled suspicion and fear, turning allies into competitors and competitors into threats. Diplomacy became a delicate game where a single miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. Leaders met behind closed doors, aware that every decision carried consequences not just for their nations, but for the entire world. The bomb's presence created a world where trust became fragile, and agreements were overshadowed by the knowledge that any nation might choose fear over reason. Citizens lived with an invisible tension, watching news reports not for economic updates, but for signs of potential conflict between nuclear powers. The threat of annihilation became a silent backdrop to everyday life. Instead of fostering unity, the bomb built walls of suspicion between nations. Treaties were signed, stockpiles were built, and militaries prepared for scenarios too horrific to imagine. The political world became a landscape of uncertainty, shaped by weapons that were never meant to be used but always had to be feared. This constant pressure reshaped foreign policy, turning the bomb into a political tool that influenced decisions long after the first explosions faded from the sky. The psychological toll on communities that lived through or near nuclear events is a quiet tragedy that continues long after physical wounds healed. Survivors of bombings or tests carried memories that never faded, memories filled with blinding light, collapsing buildings, and the desperate search for missing loved ones. Even decades later, small sounds or sudden flashes of light could trigger overwhelming fear, transporting them back to the moment when their world fell apart. Entire neighborhoods lived with a sense of uncertainty, wondering whether the illnesses appearing around them were connected to radiation exposure or simply tragic coincidence. Parents feared for their children's futures, unsure if invisible particles lingering in their environment would affect them years later. This constant worry became a shadow over everyday life. Many struggled with grief that had no outlet, mourning family members whose bodies were never recovered or whose deaths were never properly explained. Villages near testing sites felt forgotten, their pain unacknowledged by those who created the danger. The psychological scars passed from one generation to the next, shaping identities and communities through stories of loss and warnings of contamination. Fear became part of their culture, a quiet presence in every decision: where to live, what to eat, how to raise their children. The psychological impact was not only about trauma. It was about living with uncertainty, with questions that would never be fully answered, and with the constant reminder that their suffering came from an event they had no power to prevent. The long-term consequences for future generations extend far beyond the initial destruction caused by the bomb. Radiation does not disappear when the smoke clears. It lingers quietly in soil, water, and even in the human body. Children born years after the bombings or tests often carried the effects without ever understanding their origin. Some inherited illnesses linked to their parents' exposure, while others grew up in landscapes still marked by contamination. Families lived with a sense of fear about what might emerge decades later, unsure if their health problems were consequences of the past or the beginning of new struggles. These worries shaped decisions about having children, staying in their hometowns, or seeking safer places to live. Even the land itself carried the burden into the future. Once, fertile fields became unusable, and natural water sources remained unsafe for years, cutting communities off from the resources they had depended on for generations. Cultural traditions tied to the land weakened as people were forced to relocate. The social fabric of these communities changed, with some families leaving and others staying behind, divided by fear and necessity. On a global scale, the bomb set in motion a future where nations live with the constant awareness that the very weapons created decades ago could still determine humanity's fate. Future generations inherited not only contaminated landscapes, but also a world shaped by the tension and responsibility that nuclear weapons introduced. The consequences became a legacy one that those born long after the events never asked for, but must still carry.